Well, good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to this ITU Symposium on ICTs and climate change. Let me begin by saying a few words about what I think the relationship is between OFCOM and ICT. OFCOM is the Economic Regulator and Competition Authority for the UK's converged communications industry, and we have responsibilities covering television, radio, telecommunications, and the management of the radio spectrum. Whilst there seems to be a range of different definitions for ICT, and not all ICT markets fall within Ofcom's remit, all of the markets we do regulate, which are worth around £50 billion annually to the United Kingdom, could be considered to fall under the ICT umbrella. But specifically, we view television and radio as being within that scope of ICT, whereas I know a number of the other reports presented to this symposium do not. Now, we've already heard a lot about ICT energy use and trends at this symposium, and the estimates seem to vary. But I would suggest to you there seems to be a broad consensus around a headline figure of around 10% of direct energy consumption by ICTs globally, contributing something like around 3% of global carbon dioxide emissions, a little more actually than global air travel, and with forecast growth of around 50% over the next 4 years. So clearly, urgent action is required. Now, I've just remembered I'm snipping past here without using my slides, which is obviously a bad mistake. There's my first one. Don't worry about that, and I've already talked about that one, so we move on to that one. So there are, of course, already a range of initiatives, both in the UK, in Europe, and internationally, to try and halt the trend in growing ICT energy consumption. But I think it's vital that we don't lose sight of the other side of the story, the role that ICT can play in reducing the environmental impact elsewhere, moving bits rather than atoms, or dematerialization, which is a new word I learnt in reading up for today's event, as some would prefer. But as we move towards a high bandwidth future, the question is, of course, how do we ensure it's also a low carbon future? What more can we do? And where I propose to focus my remarks about what role should regulation play in the broader framework for action on climate change. Now, Ofcom's duties are set out in UK law. What that means is we can't make up our own minds on what it is that we do. It's laid out for us in legislation. And our principal duties are to further the interests of citizens, in particular in relation to communications matters, and also to further the interests of consumers in relevant markets where appropriate by promoting competition. And in carrying out those duties, Ofcom must have regard, in particular, to the desirability of encouraging investment and innovation in relevant markets, and also the desirability of encouraging the availability and use of high-speed data transfer services throughout the United Kingdom. Just in that last phrase alone, it gives you some idea how long ago it was that the Communications Act was written. They didn't use the word broadband anywhere in the Comms Act. Now, currently, Ofcom has no specific duties in relation to the environment, though that may change as revisions to the EU communications framework, which is currently going through the European Parliament, get enacted into a revised Communications Act in a few years' time, or as a result of other climate change legislation, which is currently going through the works. However, acting on climate change issues could be consistent with Ofcom's existing duties to further the interests of citizens and consumers. But if then we presume we have a duty to act on climate change, what is it that we should do? Now, one of Ofcom's regulatory principles is that we operate with a bias against intervention, but with a willingness to intervene firmly, promptly, and effectively wherever required. And in deciding whether any regulatory action is required on climate change, we first need to take into account all of the steps being taken by other stakeholders to address this issue. As we've heard during the course of this symposium, much is already being done by governments and industry stakeholders around the world. So perhaps there's not much for regulation to do. However, I'd like to suggest to you that there are two particular areas where I think regulators in general, and Ofcom in particular, may be able to help. The first comes under our duty of promoting innovation. Innovation, I guess, may offer us the best chance yet of balancing the demands of a high bandwidth future with the need to reduce carbon emissions. And as you might expect a CTO to say, technology developments, I suspect, will be key. The second is in the area of impact assessments. Now, regulatory best practice requires the publication of impact assessments of proposed regulatory interventions to ensure that the benefits outweigh the costs. Hitherto, impact assessments have not fully taken into account environmental considerations in the cost-benefit trade-off. Now, perhaps we, and indeed other regulations, should start to do so. So, if I may offer you one further concluding remark before I finish. Last year, OFCOM carried out its first ever audit of our own carbon dioxide emissions arising from OFCOM's operation as an organisation. And next week, we'll be publishing the results of that audit, together with our proposed targets and plans to reduce our carbon footprint over the next several years, alongside OFCOM's annual report. Now, I can't pre-disclose to you what that's all going to say, because otherwise it would spoil the announcement next week. But one of the many lessons we learned from this initiative was that while there are UK government best practice voluntary reporting guidelines for businesses on calculating their own carbon emissions, I'd like to suggest to you that these do not yet amount to standards for auditing and benchmarking carbon emissions, or ultimately for holding organisations accountable for meeting carbon emissions reduction targets that they set themselves. And I think that further progress on those standards are actually urgently required to underpin all of our efforts towards a high bandwidth, low carbon future. Thank you very much.